Throughout the majority of this current draft scouting cycle, Alex Sarr has been one of the premier prospects in the general consensus, and on most mock drafts you'll see he's going first to Atlanta, except a few have him going 2 to the Washington Wizards, and not many mock drafts have him going further than that. And so regardless, most scouts have a lot to be excited about with Alex Sarr entering the league this year, despite the media's chatter about the inadequacy of this year's draft. A major claim about this draft that I've been hearing is that having the first pick is worth about the same as the 8th pick in an average draft, and I think it's a pretty outrageous claim, and I think it's pretty damaging to the class at large in general. And so if you look at drafts in the last 2 years, I'd probably have him going 4th in both, which is still decent. It's definitely by no means the generational prospects that Victor Wembanyama was projected to be at the time, nor is he the right-away impact guy that Paolo Banchero was, but I still think he's definitely a worthy selection in a draft, and it's by no means a completely worthless selection. I feel like the media either paints him as the next big thing or absolutely nothing, and so my main objective with this video is to take a middle ground position, one that's a lot more realistic than the modern take-focused media channels, and that really kind of gets into what we're actually potentially getting with Sarr versus saying he's either completely nothing or completely everything. And so in just 17 minutes per game last year with the Perth Wildcats, Sarr posted numbers of 9.7 points, 4.5 rebounds, an assist, and a block and a half, as well as a steal and a half per game. And he played meaningful minutes. Perth, compared to the Illawarra Hawks with LaMelo Ball, are a lot more competitive than they were when LaMelo Ball was there. And I believe they lost in their conference finals. And so on this team, he had splits of 52% shooting from the field overall and shot 71% at the line, while shooting just under 30% from 3 on a little bit over 2 attempts per game. And so looking at Sarr's measurables, he's 7'1", 224 pounds with a 7'5" wingspan and a 9'2" standing reach. So it's pretty clear that he already has an NBA-ready body, even though we probably would like to see him fill out a little bit more. While he currently isn't as filled out as I would expect him to be in the future, like I said, Sarr is still a force to be reckoned with. He measured in at a 37-inch vertical at the combine, and that is very impressive for someone of his size, and he puts it on full display in the film. As you'll see, Sarr's main point of hype in this draft is what he can do on the defensive end of the floor, and that will certainly be a strong suit entering the league. I definitely have Sarr in high regards in this draft, but by no means am I willing to give him an incredible star upside. I don't think this guy is going to be an MVP or even an All-NBA first-team guy, and that's okay. Sarr is the perfect embodiment of the true issue with this draft, in my opinion, where I could project him to be a highly valuable NBA player, but it's tough for me to personally see an avenue where he becomes an all-NBA first-team type of guy, which is the type of upside people typically hope for in their top prospects each year. And so one thing that I still think is important to note is that, on average, most draft classes do have a Hall of Fame guy, and so it's important to keep that in mind, that these are just projections. Nikola Jokic went 42 in 2014, and so anything can truly happen. Maybe Sarr figures it out, but I like to be a little more realistic. And so let's get into why I think he'll still be an NBA player for a long career, but might not be the upper echelon, first ballot, Hall of Famer, MVP type of guy. Okay, so what impresses both me and scouts the most about Alex Sarr is easily his work on the defensive end of the floor. As someone with his frame who moves as easily as he does, I can definitely see him being someone who switches 1 through 5 right away in the NBA. Although he does run into some trouble when guarding smaller, quicker players, Sarr uses his body very well to recover, as well as create the necessary contact, if blown by, to be able to potentially contest or block a shot, even if he gets beaten. It's a little Wembanyama-esque in my opinion, how Sarr can bridge the gap between him and a smaller guard with his sheer size, and at least do a decent amount of blocks and good contests as well. Obviously, Wembanyama is about 4 inches taller than Alex Sarr is, so there's going to be a gap there, but you can see the vision that I'm seeing when you look at the film here. I would say his footwork and general mobility on switching his stances are some of his biggest weak points, on top of his knack to gamble too often and bite on pump fakes. As you'll see, one of the trends with Sarr is that he's pretty undisciplined, and I think that's something with NBA coaching he can get a lot better at. However, I still see him having a strong impact right away on the defensive end, and his ability to get in a solid defensive stance and be trouble for players on the perimeter as well as in the paint makes him a big-time prospect in this year's draft, and it's that versatility that really stands out. He can guard like a wing and then rim protect like a great center, which is not something a lot of players have. And so for some reason, Sarr was put in isolation plays on defense more than just about anyone in the NBL last season, and he was one of the best ISO defenders in that league. And so in the 88th percentile for opposing field goal percentage on isolation plays, Sarr held opponents to only 27% from the field when guarding them one-on-one. And so as a pick and roll defender, he defended the pick and roll pretty well, and even though the volume was pretty low, it makes me think that he deterred a lot of these shots as well. And so even with that in mind, opponents still shot an insane 16% with him as their primary defender. And so whether he blitzed, he hedged, or even dropped, Sarr showed the foot speed and ability to recover and effectively help his teammates on these mini basketball power plays. Sarr has a crazy motor and is always in the fight, and in my opinion, sometimes even too much. He loves flying around and doubling people, but since he's so quick and so long, he recovers pretty well. And so Sarr was very rarely posted up last season as well, but when he was, he did a great job of using his body and keeping a low center of gravity, which allowed him to stay strong and stop bigs right at the cup. However, I will say this kind of goes along with him being pretty undisciplined. He gets beaten pretty easily and also bites for moves fairly easily, which is, like I said, something he's going to need to clean up when he comes to the league. And so Sarr also does pretty well at using his body without getting fouled. And as you can see, there's a trend of him really being in tone with his body and using it very well. He moves like a wing but has the body of a big, and that's a very unique and strong asset. And so he's an elite shot blocker, as you can clearly see, and his highlights really show it. And he held opponents to just 34% at the rim. And so Sarr blocks shots off the glass and into the stands, and it really looks like a volleyball player's running around out there. And I feel like with his timing and athleticism, this is something that will definitely translate. He has great ball tracking skills and blocks dunks really well too. And I can see him easily kind of morphing into a Giannis-esque role on defense, where he'll use his length and guard like a wing on the perimeter, but then he can also use his excellent rim protection to help off of his assignment and put out some fires near the basket on drives. And so this is a very unique defensive asset that only a few players in the league currently possess, and it's definitely a game changer for defenses when a guy has such a high level of versatility like this. It hides a lot of weak spots on a defense, and it's almost like they can guard two players at once. And now this isn't something I think Sarr might have the ability to do right away, but I think it's also something he can grow into, and since this is the draft, we're talking a lot of projections here. And so this presence can be very overwhelming for opposing offenses and makes them even more prone to mistakes, which these big, quick wings can pick off in passing lanes. And so this is something that Victor Wembanyama does as well that's especially unique and dangerous. And this is partially why I personally was so excited about Zion Williamson coming out of Duke, although his body doesn't allow him to do things like that anymore. But this attribute breeds frightening defenders, especially being able to double in the paint, then run out from the three-point line and potentially block a jump shooter. It really makes people question whether or not they're even open in the first place. And if they don't question it, a lot of times they're getting blocked. And so having a guy like this doesn't mean teams have the ability to unlock them so easily though. And especially with Sarr, I personally think his offense might hold him back in this way. And it really could stop him from making the most out of his defensive versatility. In a perfect world, he could be paired nicely with a rim protecting 5 and play the 4, but since he can't really shoot yet, that 5 will need to be able to shoot at least decently well for it to work offensively. This is why it works really well with Giannis and Brook Lopez. Although Giannis isn't the knockdown shooter you would hope for him to be to make him that insane, unstoppable player, Brook Lopez, as a pretty great three-point shooter at this point in his career, really balances that out and allows Giannis to free roam on defense, since Brook's also a great rim protector. And on offense, it makes sense because you can still run a 4-out, 1-in, or even a 5-out with Giannis trying to drive because the spacing is all there. And so on the other side of this, you can look at Evan Mobley and Jared Allen. Because Jared Allen's a complete non-shooter, the Cavs have run into a lot of spacing issues, and that's largely why, other than obviously the fact that Giannis is much better than Evan Mobley, largely why a lot of the clamor around the NBA media right now is saying they need to trade Jared Allen, but you never hear anything about trading Brook Lopez. And so thinking about all of this, I'm still really optimistic about how Alex Sarr will fare in the NBA defensively, and it's interesting to look at how he can be put in similar spots as Mobley, Giannis, and even Wembanyama here. However, drawing these comparisons obviously doesn't mean that he's going to be just as effective as them right away, or even ever. His footwork and defensive IQ is still pretty unpolished, so he'll really have to work on cleaning those up before he can make the most out of his physical tools. But still, all in all, like, I really can see him being a perennial all-defensive contender. If you just look at the tools, look at the athleticism, and look at his body of work in the NBL, it's definitely going to translate. I really can't see him being a complete non-factor on defense. Definitely not somebody that people want to hunt on defense either. And at the very least, he is an above average, potentially all NBA defense type of guy. Okay, so for Sarr, I think his offensive portfolio gets a lot more hype than it probably deserves credit for, especially for a while with this weaker draft class. People were still trying to look to find a prospect that they could deem as the next unicorn to enter the league. And just because Sarr is huge and shoots a lot of threes, in my opinion, doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to be the next Wemby. And, that's not a bad thing. He can still be a really great player in this league without being a Victor Wembanyama, or at least what Wemby's on track to be. And so I still do think he has a lot of upside on the offensive end, but just not as an on-ball creator. Sarr does a lot of on-ball work in transition, but I tend to believe it's, in my opinion, and the way I see it, it's over-dribbling rather than, flashes of potential on-ball greatness, as other YouTube scouts might like to call it. The truth is, I just don't think his handle is tight enough yet and may never be tight enough to be able to fit into that Durant-Wembanyama mold, and I'd say offensively, he's definitely a lot more likely to project into a Jaren Jackson or a Jonathan Isaac type. And that's not trying to put him in a box or anything, but I think when I make videos like this, it's important to draw these comparisons, especially when we're projecting prospects, to see where they're more likely to fill out into. I don't necessarily think it's impossible that he can be a dribble drive, pull-up jumper type of guy like Wemby and Durant are, but I think it's a lot more likely that he fills out his career as somewhat of a roller, a lob threat, and potentially, if the percentages come around, someone who shoots a decent amount of catch-and-shoot jumpers. I just don't think the handle's there for him to really take somebody off the dribble and rise up over them. But it's definitely possible. And so in my opinion, Sarr's true strong suit is around the rim and in transition, where he's a 73rd percentile rim finisher and a 98th percentile floater finisher. And so he has a decent repertoire of floaters, although he doesn't make them much. He shoots a staggering 75% from the field in transition, and he's great at being quick and filling into the proper lane on the break, which is an underrated skill set to have when you look at some of the other prospects in previous drafts as well in this one. When driving down the lane, Sarr opts for finesse over power more often than I'd like to see. And honestly, I feel like he's trying to do his best Shai Gilgeous-Alexander impression at times with some dragged out steps and some euros, and so I think he's probably a lot better suited for that power shot. But although these moves do work, I do fear that NBA defenses with larger and stronger defenders might bump him out of position or even swat those types of shots. But to be fair, for his size, he does change his pace on drives really well. It moves a bit like a wing. I'm not going to say move like a guard down the lane. And so, as we're projecting this player, I think that could be something really interesting for Sarr to explore and expand on, because that is something that could potentially make him supersede the projections I'm currently giving him. And so he positions himself right into the dunker spot a lot and rises up just about over anyone, which is why I personally see those power finishes being Sarr's true strong suit in the league, because he really kind of can just poster just about anyone, because he has that 37-inch vertical, moves really well, is 7'1", like I said. And so as for his jumper, I don't really see it being something that he should look for early on in his career. I really don't hope that's kind of the focus of Alex Sarr offensively, because if the jumper never comes around, it could lead to poor development and might actually stifle what I think could be a really great pick and roll lob threat who can really potentially even stretch out as well. But that's not the feature I'm looking for. For his jumper, I think especially as he goes potentially to Atlanta with the first pick, I hope they don't have him shooting many threes, and I don't expect them to want him to do that, because Atlanta's probably looking to compete. They're not going to want to develop him kind of right away. They're wanting to develop a little bit more on the fly and maybe in the background. And so if he goes to, say, the Wizards at 2, they'll probably have him shooting, and I like to think missing a lot of those long-range jumpers early on in his career, which I think will skew his development away from what could be his best-case scenario and kind of like a good combination of risk and return archetype here. And so Sarr shot 27% on catch-and-shoot jumpers, which is really bad. And while the mechanics might look solid, I'm still pretty scared. I think Sarr was also pretty trigger happy and in my opinion took a decent amount of shots, especially catch and shoot jumpers that were a little more contested than I would like for him to take. But hopefully that shot diet gets a little more normalized when he goes into the league. And so rather than shooting in these instances, I'd rather see Sarr get into the type of DHOs that Bam Adebayo has made great use of. Rather than taking the shot, I think Sarr really could evolve as someone who gets his teammates involved for more high percentage actions if he looks to jump into these, as well as some gets and some chase ball screens on top of that. And I think that potentially could be another level for Alex Sarr's game, and to where he can mold away from the Jacksons and the Jonathan Isaacs, but maybe into a Bam Adebayo with a little bit better of a jumper if that comes around as well. And I think that could be what gives him true All-NBA upside. And so it's what a lot of non-shooting centers do, and I think it's better suited for Sarr as of right now. And if he learns how to shoot, great. That makes him even more dangerous. These actions can also lead to Sarr potentially rolling to the cup, where theoretically he should be doing a lot better than shooting a three. And I'm not saying for him to completely abandon his jumper. He's shown some decent shot creation moves like step backs and side steps, but for now, I'm not really buying it. He still needs to keep defenses honest, so I really hope he doesn't just completely stop shooting altogether, but he probably should reduce that volume. Overall, though, I am optimistic about his ability on the offensive end, but I project him to be more of a roller than an on-ball creator, and that's fine. There's still a lot of value in a player who isn't a generational unicorn. You can play like a role player on offense, be an amazing defender on defense, and you can still squeeze into all-star teams, squeeze into all-NBA teams. It's still a very impactful way to play. I mean, you look at Rudy Gobert, four-time Defensive Player of the Year, All-NBA player. He will be in the Hall of Fame, and that is a great career. And so with Sarr, you just hope that he doesn't get encouraged early on to be somebody he's not, just because this is kind of a weaker draft class and they want to pin him up as the next Porzingis, the next Towns, the next Wemby, the next Durant. I think he's a lot more suited to be a Bam, a Gobert, a Jackson, an Isaac, and that's how I hope he at least begins to train as he looks to become a pro.
Exploring back to Pinder, looks inside, quick pass, sucks.
Early doors, open inside, up.
Downhill, good things are going to happen when he's got ball in hand.
No doubt, Alex Sarr's
Nice Cotton's hands. Or just dunked it. Alex Sarr.
So I think I might have been overly critical of Alex Sarr so far in this video, but I really want to just be a lot more realistic about the standards for Alex Sarr than what has been set for him by the media. I still personally have Zaccharia Risacher as my top prospect, but could easily see a timeline in the NBA where Alex Sarr ends up having a much better career. At this point, I think I'd like to have him second on my draft board right behind Risacher, which is still really great. Do not sue me for not having him as my number one guy. I like to talk a lot about the boom or bust probability in these draft videos, and I think for Sarr, he has a lot lower risk than some of the guys in this draft. I feel like with his tools, in the worst case scenario, he's at least a decent rim protector and finisher, and even if nothing else translates, he could be a pretty valuable role player for teams and have himself a long career. His bust percentage, in my view, is a lot lower than Risacher, and his ceiling might be even higher. Now, when we're talking about prospects, it's a lot like probability because he could pan out to his top percentile rank, he could pan out to his lowest percentile rank, and it really is a lot like the lottery, just kind of a game of chance. You don't know what you're going to get in these guys because you haven't even seen them play. It's hard for me to project what his personality and his work ethic is like because I'm not doing these interviews. And so I do think his ceiling is harder to reach than Risacher's for sure. So I would say his ceiling is higher than Risacher's, but a lot lower probability. Not to say it's not going to happen once again. And it's because he's pretty raw. So I feel like for Sarr, his work, once he's in the league with these high-level coaching staffs, not to say the NBL doesn't have high-level coaching staffs, but these elite 24-hour-a-day, round-the-clock, top-of-the-line coaching staffs are going to have to spend a lot of time with him to really polish up his abilities, to make him the type of guy that some people on ESPN might be painting to be. And so overall, I think any team can be happy to draft Sarr at any point in this draft from the first pick and onwards, because as it stands, he is one of the top prospects entering the league this year. And yes, he has a lot of flaws, but the tools he possesses will definitely, in my view, make him at least, at the very least, on average, a great role player to potential high-level role player, bordering on that all-star line for years to come.